In today's lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 4 concerning evolving police strategies throughout police operations, really over the last um, 80 years. We'll talk a little bit about the history before that we talked about before, but we're really focusing on the last 80 years and really specifically the last 40 to 50. So we talked about the different eras of policing: the political era, the professional era, and then the community militarization era that we're in today. And those are pretty different. The different eras of policing have very different tactics, very different things that the individuals that made up those systems valued, and they took pretty large shifts, sort of maxim shifts, worldview shifts, for the police in operations at that time to change those things, to move from the political era to the professional era, and get rid of the corruption, get rid of the officers preying upon the citizens that they're supposed to be serving. Also, the sort of groundswell that it took 1960s into the early 1970s to move away from the professional era, to move into the community era, to get the police officers back and knowing who the good guys and who the bad guys are in an area. And while some of that's continued to this day, the more common police practice in modern times and over the course of the last 40 years has been the push towards militarization, which has really brought up a lot of the worst aspects of the political era and the professional era. The political era and the association that the police have with the political system had been, we'd worked to break that. And in modern times, it's become very reforged. There are a lot of negative connections between the police operations and the political systems. Also, the militarization has created this sort of us versus them mentality that has sort of piggybacked off and bridged off of the professional era and the blue wall of silence. So we have a situation where the police are a sort of a political tool used by that system, and at the same time, they are isolating themselves away from the communities that they serve. Instead of focusing on building a relationship between the police and the community, as we talked about in the previous lecture, both sides aren't really working towards that right now. Really, neither side is. And it's going to take movement on both sides for there to be any sort of meaningful change in the relationship between the police and the communities that they serve. A lot of the studies that we've done in the past on police operations have focused on patrol, response time, and investigative strategies. Overall, the responses and the studies themselves are laid out more in more detail in the textbook. Basically, that patrol, increased patrol isn't very effective. It doesn't reduce crime. Also, reducing patrol in some areas, really in a lot of areas, doesn't work to increase crime. There can be a lot of the effect of patrol and the effect that the police have just sort of driving around a community is there, but it can be achieved with a very low level of randomized patrol. So one of the things that came from that study was that just randomly putting in more patrol in areas doesn't help to reduce crime, and the effect of any patrol can be gained with a very low level of patrol. So by reducing the random patrol that's taking place, you're freeing up the officers to be assigned to more dedicated, directed tasks. Similarly, for most offenses, response time is irrelevant in the solving of the crime, and as long as the citizens are made aware of when the police can get to them, it doesn't really impact their sort of customer service of the whole process if they're reporting a crime that's taken place. As long as the police get there when they said that they would, it's okay, even if that is an extended period of time. Just blindly waiting on the police to arrive after you've called them is not helpful. It's also not helpful if you call the police about a serious matter and they don't arrive with all the haste that they could. So response time is really only important for very, very serious offenses, um, like the situations where the offender is still there, still actively committing crimes. Then the police would want to have a quicker response time. Again, this let police understand what things are more or less important and allowed them to free up logistically some of their time. Similar strategies were implemented following studies looking at the investigative habits of detectives. They found that a lot of the time was being wasted on menial tasks and being a lot of hours being put into cases that had a very low probability of being solved. So one of the things that they've looked to do is this sort of case screening, where they are figuring out which cases are going to be more likely to be solved, solving those first, and then any remaining time can be used on the cases of lower percentage. Again, a lot of this weighing has come from limited police resources and them being forced to utilize much of their time on the war on drugs. So again, out of these studies, we found a lot of focus on the analysis of crime rates, crime trends, where stuff happens. Also focusing on different directed patrol, using those analytical statistics to figure out where crime can be best addressed, where those resources can be the most good. And again, like that with the differential response time on certain offenses. Also, moving certain things like reporting a stolen car if there's not any sort of violence taking place, reporting that online. Most times, they might recover the car, but they're not going to find who stole the car. You make a stolen car report so that you can get insurance claim on the car. So figuring out what things are more or less important to the police, more or less important to the community, has really allowed the police to stretch the thin resources that they have. So I talked about in the last lecture, looking at the way a particular theory was misappropriated into eventually becoming zero tolerance policing. Broken windows theory and broken windows policing are very different things. Broken windows theory says that you need a combination of the police and the community itself to maintain order in an area. You don't want to have things like dilapidated houses, overgrown lawns, houses with broken windows, cars with broken windows, because those are environmental cues that tell people that are likely to commit crimes or motivated to commit crimes that nobody gives a shit about this neighborhood. And if nobody gives a shit about this neighborhood, I'm going to steal some shit out of this neighborhood. Okay? So it's a cooperation between the police and the community to reduce disorder. Broken windows policing took that idea and basically left it up to the police to force out all of the disorder. Anyone that's committing any kind of disorderly act, whether it's graffiti or peeing in an alley or drinking a beer on the sidewalk, anything that was technically illegal, the police were enforcing laws against and oftentimes instigating arrests. In addition to the arrest, they basically hassled about 10 to 20 times as many people as they arrested. So we're talking about, hundreds of thousands, not millions of arrests every year for petty crimes. And when you take a city like New York, for example, New York is where a lot of the zero tolerance stuff was implemented. A city like New York, if you arrest 1 million people for these low level offenses, but you hassle 10 million people for the same offenses, you're doing a lot to negatively impact the community's perception of the police. So you have an original theory saying the police and the community need to work together to reduce the likelihood that disorder is going to be in the neighborhood. And when it does show up, to address it. That's typically on the community side. We're not talking about the police, fixing windows in houses or mowing lawns. We're talking about each group doing their part to broken windows policing, which is basically just arrest everybody for anything that you can and hope that it works. And it didn't reduce crime. and it did increase the animosity that the police and the community have towards one another. Zero tolerance policing is a four-letter word basically in New York City. Some other types of police innovations that they've worked towards: community-oriented policing. Again, a lot of this was founded and started in the 1970s. It just hasn't really been implemented with the ferocity that it could have been because of the counter movement of police militarization. Basically, looking at the needs of the community, trying to form a partnership with the community as to what the police should be doing, the types of offenses they should be looking into, who are the good guys, who are the bad guys in the neighborhood, who is the friendly drunk in the neighborhood versus a potentially dangerous and violent drug addict. Um, Looking at line level discretion and giving those line level officers the ability to make those decisions and to inform themselves about how to make those decisions. The main thing though is prevention based, trying to prevent kids from becoming future criminals, trying to prevent community members from becoming drug addicts, giving people options and opportunities to um, break out of the cycle of poverty that they're in, especially in high crime, low socioeconomic status, census tracts, or in urban areas of concentrated disadvantage, where we're seeing community members of color being vastly overrepresented in those areas. Seeing the concentration of people and of economic destitution in these areas, the same way that we're seeing the concentration of wealth, you know, 20% of the income being produced by 1% of the population. We're seeing that same thing happen on the other side of the spectrum. We're seeing the areas that are the most impoverished, the most downtrodden, become more so and infect the areas around them, affect the property values, affect the economic opportunities for people that live in those areas. And the police could be doing a lot to affect change in that, but that's not what their directive has been, unfortunately. We also have problem oriented policing, which is kind of a mix between community policing and militarization, because you're using some of the localized information about an area, but you're using it in a sort of strike first mentality. So, focusing on a small percentage of the population causing many crimes. It can focus on people, it can focus on a type of crime, or hotspots policing, sort of a specialized version of problem oriented policing, focuses on places. Or it could do a combination of those things. So, what they do is they do this process called SARA, which stands for Scanning, Analyze, Response, and Assessment. So, you're figuring out what's wrong, you're figuring out a way to deal with it, you're dealing with it, and then you're seeing how you did. And that's important to know. Having realistic goals and having the ability to achieve those can be very effective in figuring out a new policy, instead of just having your goals be too high, failing every time, and then thinking that nothing's working. So problem oriented policing has been shown as effective because a lot of crimes, especially in major urban areas, are committed by a small number of people. So you can concentrate a lot of resources on those people, on those places, on those particular types of offenses, and you can see again the most gains where you have the highest crime. We've also seen in the last 20 years, the implementation of what's known as intelligence-based policing. CompStat is a common model that's used in Atlanta. It's known as COBRA, where they have meetings every 2 weeks. You have the heads of the different areas of the city come and talk about what's happening, and you're basically seeing who did what well, and almost kind of like a reintegrative shaming, or in I don't want to use the biblical parable, but there is a good one about a man giving resources to his disciples and then coming back 6 months later and seeing what they've done with them. As some people kept them, some people put the resources to work. And that's sort of like what's happening in these ComStat meetings, these Cobra meetings. What were you supposed to get done? What did you get done? What can we do to get stuff done next for the next 2 weeks of the next month? So accountability, planning, and cooperation. Um, Before you had these sort of scheduled, structured meetings, um, there might not have been communication between the different areas of a city. There might even be professional rivalry. But if you're having, for instance, burglaries take place on the edge of a jurisdictional area, um, you might not notice a pattern. But if when you have this combination of resources, this cooperation, it makes those patterns easier to find out. So that can be very helpful, especially in high profile investigations or in investigations of serious offenses. So we are, it takes a long time to change police operations, and it takes major events to change those things. But we have in the past 20 or so years started to learn what types of mistakes that we've made, trying to address those mistakes and avoid repeating them in the future. At least some individuals have. Um, but it almost feels like we're at one of those times where there's a reckoning coming in terms of changing the way that police operate and the way that they handle their business. But we'll see again some of the reasons why um, police agencies are run the way that they are and the effects it has on the individuals as we move on throughout the course of the semester.